Most people don't expect a country worn down by decades of conflict to launch one of the most ambitious engineering projects in modern history. Yet right now, Afghanistan is carving a colossal waterway through its desert, a move so bold it could either save millions of lives or push an entire region into chaos. It starts with a landscape that looks almost abandoned by nature. In the north, the ground stretches out in cracked layers as if the earth itself has given up. Wells have sunk so low that families walk miles for water that barely fills a cup. For years, farmers watched their fields fade into dust, praying for rain clouds that never formed. When the severe drought hit in 2021, the worst in nearly 30 years, everything collapsed faster than anyone expected. Soil hardened into stone. Reservoirs shrank into muddy pits. Entire villages packed up and left because staying meant risking hunger with every sunrise. By the time the drought had finished sweeping across the country, hundreds of thousands had been forced to leave their homes, chasing water that kept slipping farther away. And underneath all of that suffering was one unavoidable truth. Afghanistan had run out of time. The country couldn't wait for international aid, and it couldn't keep watching its farmland vanish. Leaders knew the North would never recover unless they found a new source of water, something big enough to revive fields that hadn't seen life in years. That search led them back to an idea almost forgotten. Decades ago, a vision had been drawn up and shelved, dismissed as too risky, too expensive, too ambitious for a nation struggling to survive. But with the country facing one of its worst environmental crises in modern history, that old plan suddenly became Afghanistan's last real shot at turning the tide, and reviving it would set off a chain of events no one, not even its creators, could fully prepare for. But what they were about to build would pull far more than water out of the Amu Darya. It would pull the attention, fear, and anger of every country downstream. Long before bulldozers rolled into the desert and satellite images showed a scar stretching across northern Afghanistan, the idea for this project existed as nothing more than a forgotten sketch. Decades earlier, King Zaire Shah proposed tapping the Amu Darya, the one river powerful enough to revive the north, but the plan died in the noise of conflict and political collapse. For half a century, it sat untouched, buried under shifting governments and endless instability. Yet the problem never went away. Year after year, drought kept grinding the land down. Poverty spread, harvests shrank, and as international aid faded, the country realized that waiting for help was no longer an option. If Afghanistan wanted water, it had to carve its own path to it. That's when the old proposal resurfaced, suddenly no longer a dream, but a necessity. Leaders dusted off the forgotten idea and reshaped it into something far larger, a canal that would tear through the desert, pull water from the Amu Darya, and send it deep into provinces that had nearly given up on agriculture. It was a daring move, especially for a nation where half the population lives below the poverty line. No donors, no foreign engineering firms, no international guarantees. Afghanistan would fund and build everything on its own, even if the cost pushed the limits of what the country could shoulder. And once the decision was made, the pace became relentless. Thousands of workers were deployed into the harsh terrain, operating day and night under a rival schedule that shocked those watching from afar. Heavy machines cut through the desert as if racing against an unseen deadline. But behind that urgency was something much deeper, a recognition that failure wasn't just a setback, it was the difference between land that could feed millions and land that would stay forever barren. With the past guiding them and desperation pushing them forward, Afghanistan began shaping a project. What finally emerged from that burst of urgency was a structure far bigger than anything Afghanistan had attempted in decades. The Koch Tepe Canal wasn't just another irrigation ditch, it was a colossal trench carved straight into the earth, stretching for nearly 180 miles and opening wide enough to swallow a football field. Its depth about the height of a 3-story building. For a country running on limited resources, the scale alone felt almost unreal. But the numbers only tell half the story. The canal was engineered to move an enormous volume of water, more than 23,000 cubic feet every second. That's not a gentle flow. It's a torrent strong enough to reshape entire districts. At full capacity, the canal could push out close to 15 billion gallons in a single day, enough to turn lifeless plains into active farmland again. And that was exactly the point. Afghanistan wasn't aiming for a symbolic project. It was aiming to restore over 500,000 hectares of desert, turning them back in the land where wheat, rice, and vegetables could grow at full scale. If it worked, northern Afghanistan might feed itself for the first time in years, and possibly produce enough to sell beyond its borders. What shocked observers even more was how quickly everything progressed. Crews finished the first 67-mile stretch in just 18 months, far ahead of the original timeline. Massive hydraulic gates went up along the route, built tall and heavy to handle flood season and the blistering heat that follows. More than 10,000 workers stayed active around the clock, backed by thousands of machines scraping through millions of cubic feet of dirt every single day. By the time most of the world realized how far the project had come, Afghanistan had already already completed more than 60% of the canal. Water was flowing through early sections. Dry fields were beginning to regain color. Villages that had given up on farming were suddenly watching their soil come alive again. But there was a catch, one so big that engineers around the world immediately noticed it. The canal didn't have a concrete lining. It ran on compacted earth alone, a faster and cheaper approach that carried massive risk. Afghanistan chose speed over safety, and that decision, while understandable, opened the door to a problem that would shake the entire project. Because the moment they pushed water through the unlined sections, the canal revealed its first major weakness, one that almost no one saw coming. For months, the project looked unstoppable. Workers kept digging, machines never cooled, and each new update made the canal seem like a miracle rising from the dust. But underneath all the progress, the ground was hiding a warning, one that erupted without a single moment of hesitation. Near the end of 2023, a large stretch of the canal gave way. It didn't crack slowly or show gentle signs of strain. It collapsed in an instant. A wall of water burst through the weakened bank and tore into the desert with terrifying force. Within minutes, millions of gallons were rushing into the open plain, spreading out so fast that crews barely had time to get out of the way. Later estimates put the total loss at around 26 billion gallons, an amount so massive that the desert transformed into an artificial lake almost overnight. Satellite images captured the aftermath. A broad, unfamiliar body of water sitting in the middle of northern Afghanistan, widening with every passing day. The most unsettling part wasn't the size of the lake, it was the way it kept expanding. The dry earth drank in the water like a sponge, pulling the flood deeper into the ground, softening the soil, and creating pockets of instability along the canal's edge. Engineers who reviewed the images all pointed to the same problem. Without a concrete lining, the canal walls were vulnerable to erosion from the inside out. Everyone understood why Afghanistan had taken the risk. Lining the canal would have required years and hundreds of millions more in funding, time that countries simply didn't have. People were already fighting hunger, and every season without water meant more fields dying and more families forced to abandon their homes. So the crews didn't stop. They stepped into the damaged channel, sometimes working knee-deep in fast-moving water, reinforcing the collapsed section while the flow continued behind them. It was a race against pressure, mud, and the fear that another break could happen without warning. The repair held, but the message was clear. Speed had bought progress, but it had also bought instability. And if one break...
The Amu Darya isn't just a river, it's the backbone of Central Asia, a lifeline that feeds farms, powers cities, and keeps entire nations alive. For decades, its flow has been carefully divided among the countries that rely on it. Old Soviet-era agreements set strict quotas, carving out portions for Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Every canal, every cotton field, every hydroelectric dam in the region depends on those numbers staying steady. But Afghanistan was never part of that deal. Despite holding nearly 40% of the river's basin, it received no official share, no guaranteed rights, and no real voice. Years of conflict kept its usage low, leaving downstream nations comfortable with the idea that Afghanistan would always take only a small fraction. That era is over. As the Kosh-Tepe Canal stretches deeper into the desert, it pulls more water from the Amu Darya, and for the first time in decades, the river's balance is shifting in a way Central Asia did not expect. Uzbekistan sits directly in the path of this change. Cotton drives its economy, employs millions, and shapes its exports. Even a modest drop in water can slash yields, disrupt food supplies, and hit the country's GDP within a single season. Turkmenistan faces the same fear. Its wheat fields, which feed more than 6 million people, depend on steady irrigation. A shrinking river doesn't just threaten crops, it threatens the price of bread, the stability of markets, and the livelihoods of entire rural communities. Then there are Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, where the river powers turbines that keep lights on across vast regions. When water levels fall, reservoirs dip, turbines slow, and neighborhoods sit in darkness. Factories shut down, energy grids wobble, daily life becomes unpredictable. So when Afghanistan began pulling water on a scale no one had seen before, alarms spread across Central Asia. The concern wasn't abstract, it was immediate. Every mile of canal built in Afghanistan is water not reaching fields, dams, and cities downstream. Every drop diverted has the potential to trigger shortages, economic losses, and political friction. For countries already watching their rivers shrink from climate pressure, the Kosh-Tepe Canal isn't just a project, it's a direct shift in the region's most fragile resource. And the fear is simple. If the river's flow weakens too much, the consequences will not be contained by any border. But the deeper danger sits even farther downstream, in a place where an entire sea once stood and where a single mistake could push a dying ecosystem past the point of return. If you want to understand why the region is so terrified of Afghanistan's new canal, you only need to look at the ghost of a sea that once dominated Central Asia. The Aral Sea used to stretch across tens of thousands of square miles, teeming with fish, fish, lined with busy ports, and surrounded by communities that lived off its endless blue horizon. Then the rivers that fed it, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, were redirected for massive cotton projects. Bit by bit, more water was pulled out than replaced, until the fourth largest lake on Earth began collapsing into sand. What's left today is a cracked wasteland called the Aralkum Desert, a place where fishing boats sit stranded on dry ground, and the air carries dust laced with chemicals from decades of farming. Storms now lift millions of tons of that toxic dust every year. It travels over fields, across borders, and even as far as the Arctic. People living near the former shoreline deal with breathing issues and high illness rates. The disaster didn't stay local. It spread across continents. That's why the Kosh-Tepe Canal feels like a nervous echo of history. The Amu Darya is already struggling to reach what remains of the northern Aral Sea. Restoration projects have brought back small pockets of water, revived some fish species, and offered a glimmer of hope. But that progress hangs by a thread. Any major new diversion could unravel decades of recovery in a matter of seasons. Scientists warn that if the canal keeps drawing water at full scale, the river might never deliver enough downstream to sustain the fragile ecosystems trying to recover. And if that happens, the southern Aral, already on life support, could disappear entirely. Dust storms would intensify, soil would degrade faster, farmland across multiple countries could suffer from rising salinity and polluted topsoil. This isn't just an environmental issue. It's a chain reaction that affects food supply, public health, and the stability of entire communities. Once the land dries out and the winds begin carrying chemicals again, no border can stop the spread. So while Afghanistan sees survival in the Kosh-Tepe Canal, others see a warning. One more misstep could revive the same disaster that destroyed an entire sea. Yet even with all these risks hanging over the region, Afghanistan is pushing forward, and the impact inside the country is unlike anything people expected.
For all the fear spreading across Central Asia, the view inside Afghanistan looks completely different. In the northern provinces where the drought hit hardest, the Kosh-Tepe Canal isn't seen as a threat. It's seen as a lifeline finally arriving after decades of being ignored. The moment construction began, daily life started to shift. Thousands of workers found steady jobs almost overnight. Many had spent years drifting between temporary work and long stretches of unemployment, but the canal gave them something rare: predictable income and a reason to stay. Small towns along the route came alive again. Cafes reopened, workshops filled with orders, and roadside stalls began selling meals to crews who worked from sunrise until long after dark. Families who once depended on uncertain harvests suddenly had money coming in from construction wages. The canal wasn't even finished, yet it was already rewriting local economies. And for many farmers who abandoned their villages during the worst drought years, the idea of returning home no longer felt impossible. That's where the hope lies. The project promises drinking water for communities that have spent years relying on unreliable wells. It offers farmland to those who lost everything when the soil turned to dust. Analysts estimate that more than 2 million people could directly benefit once the canal is fully operational, not just through farming, but through storage facilities, transport work, irrigation systems, and food processing plants that will emerge if the land comes back to life. The shift in agriculture could be even more dramatic. For decades, Afghanistan was known for vast opium fields stretching across the countryside. But after the strict ban hit in 2022, farmers were left with nothing to replace it. Many feared economic collapse. With a steady flow of water, the government now pushes an entirely new vision: legal crops, especially wheat. Tens of thousands of acres have already been set aside, and officials speak openly about becoming a wheat exporter in the next few years. Skeptics question whether the timeline is realistic, but one thing is certain: water gives Afghanistan options it hasn't had in decades. Without it, the country stays trapped in cycles of drought, hunger, and dependency. With it, even fragile hope becomes something stronger. Still, all this progress rests on a single condition: the canal has to survive long enough to deliver what it promises. And the challenges waiting ahead are far bigger than the leaks and collapses already faced. Because as the final stages of construction approach, Afghanistan is stepping into the most difficult part of the entire project, and one mistake could bring everything crashing down. Despite the momentum, the Kosh-Tepe Canal is now entering the stage where the risks grow sharper than ever. The final stretch isn't just about digging dirt, it's about building the structures that will decide whether this entire project stands strong or collapses under its own weight. Crews are laying long networks of underground irrigation pipes, shaping concrete bridges, installing pump stations, and weaving in drinking water lines that will determine the canal's future reliability. Almost 2/3 of the system is already in place, and water is flowing through many of the completed segments. Villages along these stretches have watched barren land revive in real time as dry soil begins absorbing the first steady water it has seen in years. But with every mile the canal expands, the pressure
pressure around it grows heavier. The biggest threat isn't only the land or the engineering, it's the budget. Afghanistan is paying for every inch of the project itself, something almost unheard of for infrastructure on this scale. The original estimate hovered around $684 million, but rising costs have already pushed the figure.
And then there's the part no one can predict: climate. If temperatures rise faster than expected or the river shrinks more quickly than models suggest, the canal could become a channel without enough water to fill it. That scenario would devastate the farmers now waiting for revived fields and give neighboring countries even more reason to challenge the project. Everything is balancing on a razor's edge. Structural cracks, unstable soil, sudden collapses, or a single miscalculation could undo years of work. Political tensions are already simmering. Downstream nations worry about dwindling water, while inside Afghanistan, the hopes of millions hinge on the canal succeeding. There is no middle ground left. Either the Koch-Tepe Canal becomes the backbone of a new agricultural era, or it triggers a regional crisis that no one can contain. And as the country steps closer to the finish line, the final question becomes impossible to ignore. What happens if the water stops flowing, or worse, if it flows exactly as planned? The Koch-Tepe Canal is more than a construction project. It is Afghanistan's boldest gamble in decades, a symbol of hope for millions of people who have endured drought, poverty, and displacement. For farmers, workers, and families, it represents a chance to reclaim land, rebuild communities, and secure livelihoods that were long lost. At the same time, the canal is a flashpoint for an entire region. Downstream nations watch every mile, every cubic foot of water diverted, knowing that the balance of agriculture, energy, and daily life hangs in the flow. The history of the Aral Sea is a stark warning of what could happen if water is mismanaged. One decision here, one miscalculation there, and the consequences could ripple across borders, affecting millions more than just those in Afghanistan. Yet, in the middle of all the risk, progress continues. Workers dig, engineers calculate, and communities adapt, driven by the promise of transformation. If successful, the canal could turn deserts into fertile fields, revive crops, generate jobs, and even reshape Afghanistan's role in Central Asia. The nation could finally step out of decades of dependency and crisis, asserting control over one of its most vital resources. But the outcome is far from certain. Climate pressures, structural challenges, budget constraints, and geopolitical tension all loom like shadows over the project. Every drop of water that flows through the Koch-Tepe Canal carries with it the weight of possibility and peril alike. For Afghanistan, the canal is a lifeline. For the region, it is a test. And for the world, it is a reminder that access to water, one of the simplest yet most essential resources, can shape the destiny of nations. The question now is not whether the canal will finish, it's whether it can survive everything that stands in its way, and whether the hopes tied to it will finally be